Welcome everyone for coming tonight. I really appreciate you being here. This is our seminar in American and New York Material Culture at Bard Graduate Center. The series is sponsored by the Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Horowitz Foundation, to which we're very grateful. I'm Associate Professor Catherine Whalen, where I teach American Material Culture Studies, and I co-convened this series with my colleagues, Professors Meredith Lin and Ivan Gaskell. I thank our speakers tonight, Professors Tavia Nyong'o and Brian Eugenio Herrera. Also, many thanks to Laura Minsky, who you've just met, our Associate Director of Research Programs, who makes everything possible. So Professor Lin will speak next.
Hello, everyone. We'd like to begin our program tonight by acknowledging that the Bard Graduate Center and the places where many of us are tonight are located within Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape, as well as the past, present, and future home of many Indigenous peoples. We do this to honor customary Indigenous protocols of thanking hosts, and also to bring to attention the continuing realities of colonial oppression and dispossession. We also wish to recognize the essential contributions of others who were forced to leave their own lands and traveled here against their will. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Tavia Myango. He is the William Lamson Professor of Theater and Performance Studies at Yale University. He also teaches in the African American Studies and American Studies programs. These callings testify to his work across disciplines and his commitment to the importance of this kind of practice. They also indicate the range and depth of his outstanding and inspiring scholarship. His research focuses on cultural analysis, ethics, aesthetics, past and present. He recently published the book Afro-Fabulations, The Queer Drama of Black Life, and his 2009 book, The Amalgamation Waltz, Race, Performance, and the Ruses of Memory, won the Errol Hill Award for the best book in African American theater and performance studies. He also co-edits the journal Social Text and the Sexual Cultures book series at NYU Press. Tonight, he will speak on Black Arts of the Archive. Our second speaker is Brian Eugenio Herrera. He's Associate Professor of Theater and Gender and Sexuality Studies at Princeton University. He also contributes to their programs in American Studies and Latino Studies. He is fully committed to practice across disciplines and modes of engagement, well evidenced by his acclaimed and original work. In 2015, he published Latin Numbers, Playing Latino in 20th Century US Popular Performance. This book received the George Jean Nathan Award for Dramatic Criticism. He also co-edits the series Performances and American Cultures for NYU Press. Professor Herrera is also an accomplished performer. His work includes I Was the Voice of Democracy and Touchtones. He is also the resident scholar for the Soul Project, which supports Latinx playwrights in New York City and beyond. He also works closely with the organization Art Equity, which supports inclusion in the arts. Tonight, he will speak on the tawdry, terrifying, but totally true history of the casting couch. As Laura said, following both presentations, I'll moderate a discussion with our speakers and panelists from Bard Graduate Center. They are Professors Lynn and Gaskell and Helen Polson, Emily Riley, Director of Public Engagement, and doctoral students Lauren Drapula, Colin Fanning, and Elizabeth Kane. Now I will turn things over to Professor Nyong'o.
Thank you, Professor Whalen, for that kind introduction and to the invitation to the Bard Graduate Center to present on my work, which in this case is an opportunity to go back to, I almost said my juvenilia, but I'll instead say my first book, research I did originally for the Amalgamation Waltz, which has been the gift that keeps on giving in terms of shifting relationships to the historical archive and different uses of the materials that I was interested in, although those many years ago when I first began researching race, performance, and memory in the 19th century. So I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes, and as were my instructions, and I will start by sharing my screen, show you some images, and you will tell me if I'm showing you the right screen or the wrong one. Can you see my, oh, actually, I mean, yeah, oops, let me stop that share, try it again. There's always some. Okay. Are you seeing my?
It looks good, Tav.
It looks good. Wow, the first time. Okay, so this version of the story starts after I wrote the book, which I hope you had the opportunity to read, at least a chapter in Night's Eye. A couple of years ago, when I received a call from the New York Times obituary desk. Some of you may recall that a couple of years ago, the New York Times was writing obituaries of women that they had missed from all periods in the history of the, I guess, the publication history of the Times. And the reporter was interested in doing a retrospective obituary on one Mary Jones, and wanted to know if I had additional information about her, and beyond the research that I had done for my book, and also shared on in a web queer website, and also in a historical exhibition at the Leslie Lohman Arts Museum in Soho. I directed the reporter to some other resources, but as far as I know, that obituary never occurred. But it renewed my interest in the shifting relationship to this figure, whose image I will talk about now. So this lithograph from 1836, known in most catalogs as the Man Monster, is appeared for sale in New York on in the offices of the printer, lithographer, and caricaturist Henry R. Robinson, who had an office on Cortlandt Street and amongst other locations, and purported to depict a Mary Jones, aka Peter Sawali, et cetera, a transgender sex worker who was apprehended, tried, and convicted in Lower Manhattan of grand larceny. Hence the pocketbook, which in this particular version of the lithograph is color coded to match her outfit, although that, in fact, you'll see in other versions of this image is quite clearly a purloined wallet that tells the tale of her the theft for which she was sent to Sing Sing, generating a story that continues to live on into today, thanks in no small part to this print. In this presentation, I will refer to Mary Jones with using she, her, hers pronouns, but when I wrote the amalgamation waltz, I used male pronouns, and so in part, I'm thinking, in part, telling the story is tracing the transformation of queer and trans historiography in terms of how we think about historical figures, and what the consequences, right, of our seemingly neutral factual language for referring to, in particular, Black people, right? So just I won't tell you the whole story. You can read my book. You can also read the version of it that appears in C. Riley Snorton's very important book, Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity. I'm just going to show this image here of Robinson's store, both because it gives you a sense of a snapshot, as it were, of the political and visual culture within which this lithograph would have circulated. You could picture it in that window on display alongside other spectacular images, sensationalist images, for instance, the Helen Jewett murder. Thinking of this sort of symmetry, the fearful symmetry, if you will, between the street spectacle of Robinson's lithographic business and the seeming exposure of Mary Jones as a man monster, when in fact, subsequent in about a couple of years after the date of her arrest and imprisonment, Robinson himself was also arrested and charged for selling pornography under the table at this very establishment. So we can think about the circulation of respectable fronts for criminal activity and how both the white male owner of the means of visual production and reproduction, as well as this sort of criminalized Black figure, are both circulating within economies in which appearances are rarely as they seem. So I don't have time to do a really close reading of the image, but we can talk about that later. Some things that I will draw out. This is another print. So this is another version of the print in black and white, held in the collection of the National Museum of American History. These are just some quotes here on the left from the New York World, in which Mary Jones is described as being attired in a la mode de New York, doing a fair business both in money making, i.e. pickpocketing, but also practical amalgamation, which I can talk a lot about, but I will only do so when asked. And then this, particular phrase, which in my original book, I used this language. I reported this language of her or his dingy ears. Clearly, there's a racist caricature in the language here, as well as a transphobic, to use that term, right? But it is also interesting to me, and might be an interesting point of discussion, that the New York World is actually prepared to accept a racial indeterminacy in Mary Jones, her or his. That was actually something that I wrestled with, but I'm continuing to find the right language for. Ultimately, history itself may not be the right language to pin down, as it were, gender onto the Black body. Nonetheless, and we see this up until today. If you do research, I took this snapshot from the National Museum of American History. The ways in which this image is found or findable within archives remains within a binary gendered framework in which it is described as a full-length portrait of a young man dressed as a woman, right? And so this is a way of kind of excluding the possibility of a transgender reading by implying that there is a truth behind the disguise, and that the power of exposure that the state was interested during the criminal trial is also somehow reappearing in ostensibly neutral guise, lo these many centuries later, in the brief neutral description of this image. So thinking about the circulation and uses of material culture is key when we then turn to some quick examples I'll show in my final 3 minutes of contemporary artists, meaning from the late 90s to the present, who have returned and reimagined this particular lithograph, but also the story of the person behind it, as it were. And the first artist I want to talk about is the painter and multimedia artist Leslie Sarr, who produced this very large multimedia work, more than I had opportunity to see it once, and it's more than my height. At least it was more than human height, right? But it's quite large. The Con Art of Peter Sawali is what Sar named it. So it's larger than life-sized mixed media portrait that was inspired by the artist encountering the man-monster print in Charles Adams's Dear Dead Days, a book of historical oddities and images published in 1959. Now, one thing to know is that Sar was only, when I interviewed her, she told me she was really only going on the image and the caption provided, meaning the print I just showed you and the text below, right? And yet she nonetheless intuits several key truths about Mary Jones's story. Placing the convict's plate around her neck. Sar likens the print to a modern day mugshot. And it's also quite interesting how she's chosen to place the sort of male face, ostensibly the true face behind the visage, right? Upside down and to the right, floating mysteriously upwards and off the canvas. Neither body is true, it is implied. And in order to even see in order to see Peter Sawali, right, as opposed to Mary Jones, one has to reorient one's gaze, right? So Sar's poetic image places her subject in a space between genders. And in her larger oeuvre, which I can only mention briefly here, she is very much interested in the world of those who are perceived to be freaks and oddities, and how they in fact occupy a kind of a space of possibility that that the normal refuse. Another image that was actually commissioned, as it were, for the Leslie Lohman exhibit was by the artist Vaginal Davis, who made this small drawing in which Davis, for those who don't know, is a performance artist and drag queer punk icon who has lectured about the figure that she calls the she monster of old New York, and told me that she aspires to play him / her on screen. Miss Davis has, so this original painting or drawing is here. I guess I'll call it a painting. And it's almost, she described it as a concept drawing for a potential film role. The one thing that this version or vision of Mary Jones pulls out is the status of the alias, right? So alias Mary Jones, alias Eliza Smith. And this is important because Vaginal Davis is also kind of an alias, but also an homage to Angela Davis, right? And this gets to this question in my mind that was ringing after the Times called me, which is, so what is this idea of being denied the honorific of an obituary, right? A life that's sort of recognizable and legible to the paper of record. Are these sort of mythic and iconic images? I'll just show some images of Vaginal Davis kind of evoking her namesake of Angela Davis in a performance she did in 2012 as really kind of suggesting a different way of thinking about history, memory, and fabulation. This approach to the legacy of Mary Jones comes out in the final two. I realize I'm a little bit over time, but I'm two more artists and I'm done. Arthur Jaffa has most recently taken two self-portraits as Mary Jones, one La Scala and the other the man monster Duffy, in which the sort of violence, well, on the one hand, the allure of her fugitivity and a kind of theatricalized self-possession, and then also this sort of violence of exposure, by the state, in his own words and the artist's words. This looking to Jones's story as a way of thinking about the way the social stresses, weights, fissures, and breaks of being Black, and concomitantly Black being and thingification in the world. So again, these are like larger than life self-portrait photographs that were quite startling to encounter in the gallery space. And then the final, just as a clip image from 2019, the director and artist Tourmaline has returned again to the story of Mary Jones, this time with two short films, Salacia and Mary of Ill Fame. And both star Rowan Amon as Mary Jones. And what's interesting about these films is that they Tourmaline relocates Mary from Soho, from Lower Manhattan to Seneca Village, the free Black land-owning community and Underground Railroad stop in Upper Manhattan. I believe we have a specialist in the historical archaeology of Seneca Village on the call who will be joining us later, which will be really interesting. And so Tourmaline talks about looking to and almost identifying with Mary Jones as someone who also made a wayward way out of no way, as a transcestor, and moving past a kind of historical reconstruction to, again, I would say a sort of fabulation of her history, perhaps a critical fabulation, to use Saidiya Hartman's formulation. And so when we think about the search for Seneca Village, which now historians and conservators and archaeologists are doing in Central Park, which brings us to the theme and topic of material culture, how do we then think of the role of artists who are in one sense inventing the ancestors they need, or the ancestors that we need, right? But are not necessarily opposed to historical work, right? But they are, to use a phrase from the artist Yvonne Awar, calling in from that which does not exist. And that phrase really resonates with all the artists that I've shown today, calling in from that which does not exist in order to place the people who, as we see in this image of Central Park, the people who are missing. So I'll stop there.
I think I'm on, and I will start my video. I'm sharing my screen, and let me know if you're seeing a ghost light. Are folks seeing a ghost light?
Yep.
Okay. So thank you so much, Tav, and thanks so much to Laura and to Meredith, and especially Catherine, and to everybody at BARD who who's created this opportunity for me to join you. I'm joining you from Princeton, New Jersey, which is the ancestral home of the Lenni Lenape, and so I offered some of my comments tonight in recognition of the living culture of the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape people. And in an abrupt shift of gears from that notion of respect, I want to sort of give a frame for my conversation tonight, which is going to be in the realm of the illicit in certain ways. And this is my title, The Tawdry, Terrifying, but Totally True History of the Casting Couch. And in my own act of critical fabulation, I've sort of built out, as we've seen with Vaginal Davis, we've seen sort of the idea of the tabloid as sort of a way, as sort of a visual moniker of both sort of a particular, I'm struck by the genealogy between Richardson and this tabloid of this kind of question of what are we seeing and what is the cover under which truths, under which certain kinds of knowledges circulate. So I should also note that my comments tonight will likely, I will edge toward toward contexts of sexual explicitness and sexual violence, though nothing is going to be particularly elaborately depicted, but there will be mostly references and glancing descriptions of situations involving sexuality in both consensual and non-consensual. So just as an FYI. So moving on, I want to start with, again, sort of where Tavia's talk took us, which was to the realm of contemporary art. And I'm going to look at 3 examples of contemporary art in which the idea, this metonymic idea of the casting couch, figures centrally. This is a work by a collaboration between Plastic Jesus and Ginger, both of whom were conceptual installation artists working in an activist modality. This is a mixed media installation that was installed in early March, almost 3 years ago this week, basically in anticipation of that year's Oscars. This was within the year of the allegations and revelations around Harvey Weinstein's multi-decade history of exploitative violence, leveraging his power as one of the Hollywood industry's most influential producers, and leveraging that as a kind of weapon. And here what we see is a mixed, it's a molded sculpture that uses both fiberglass and then adorned and adapted found objects. And it was placed in a park not too far from the site of that year's Oscars, and was planned to be there as an Instagrammable site that would be in place through the Oscars. As it happened, weather forced the artist to remove the object in anticipation, but it did achieve its initial impact of being very photographable for the 24 hours that it was up. But as you note, there is the empty space next to Weinstein on this couch, and it was designed as an Instagrammable object. And it is part of a series. You might know Ginger from the Naked Trump series of sculptures that happened in 5 cities in 2016. And then Plastic Jesus sort of has done, over a period of 5 years, did different gold statues that critiqued various modalities of Hollywood hypocrisy. The same week that Plastic Jesus and Ginger installed the casting couch sculpture, the New Yorker offered a different kind of public-facing art and commentary with a cover by Chris Ware called Golden Opportunity, which again uses the casting couch as a scenario, activating an awareness of this scene, sort of invoking this knowledge of a scene of sexual exploitation as part of a feature of in this case, again, a faceless actress, but on the couch, and this kind of activating this as a narrative scenario as a way of commenting, as the magazine itself said, arriving on newsstand 6 days before the Academy Awards, the image nods at what was a tumultuous year in the film industry. So what I was interested by the historical coincidence of Plastic Jesus and Ginger working in a very street art way, and then Chris Ware working on a magazine cover. Both of these are sort of public-facing modes of art, even though they come out of different provenances, and they sort of open up our questions about the ways in which art utilize known scenarios to activate questions and conversations. And this also puts into context a controversy that erupted about 4 to 6 months prior in Los Angeles with one of the more well-regarded public art installations from the early 2000s that has been in place all the way along. It's a fiberglass, it's a mosaic pathway sculpture that culminates in this moment. It's called The Road to Hollywood by artist Erica Rothenberg. And it's sort of in a series of winding pathways that go multiple levels in a shopping complex in early Hollywood, in a Hollywood shopping mall. It was installed in 2002. And at the end of the path is this large oversized daybed that over years had come to be vernacularly referred to as the casting couch sculpture. And so a variety of tourist websites said you could go even see this monument to the casting couch. And it was in the wake of the Weinstein revelations that this object became the subject of a new kind of scrutiny and was actually removed from public view, possibly temporarily. It's a little bit unclear whether or not it's gone forever. And inspiring the ire of the art critic of the Los Angeles Times, who said, in the eyes of some, an innocuous daybed became a casting couch. And indeed, that measure of indeterminacy of what does this couch mean? What does it mean to put a couch in the road to Hollywood as the destination? And in some ways, this is the question of why I'm working on this idea, this metonymic activated idea of the casting couch, because it comes up. I'm working on a book project called Casting a History. And one of the fascinating threads about it is that there's a lot of sort of the idea of the casting couch, jokes about the casting couch, references to the casting couch persist. And indeed, as I dug into the history of the material practices of how professional actors have had access to professional opportunities, it became clear that the emergence of one of the most signal features of the professional actor's experience in the 20th century, the headshot, actually the fact that the headshot emerged as such a crucial currency of the acting profession actually had, in an oblique and indirect way, but a really formidable way, it had its connections to the casting couch, because indeed the casting couch and controversies around the idea of sexual exploitation and the transactional intimacies of the Hollywood of in the first decades of Hollywood being a boom industry had actually occasioned a measure of popular attention, and not unlike that which accrued in 2017 and 2018. As in the first decade or so of the industry, there was a number of scandals, many of which involved the stories of sexual exploitation of the thousands of young people flowing to this booming industry in California, seeking their fame and fortune, and finding themselves in different ways, men and women alike, vulnerable to the predations of this industry. And as a sort of a gesture toward reform, the industry, in one of its first acts, where Hollywood studios collaborated together, they agreed to erect a company called the Central Casting Corporation, which they all agreed to contract with and subscribe with, that would be a free placement service, and to set up this new organization that would in some ways professionalize and manage the process of especially day players and extra hiring. They hired a former postmaster called William H. Hayes. You might know Will Hayes for his more famous contribution to American culture, especially American cinematic culture, of that he is the same Hayes as the Hayes Code, because indeed 4 years before he started the production, he led the production code office. His big success was introducing what was called scientific casting to the industry of casting. And part of what scientific casting was making casting more clerical, in that an actor would deposit a resume with a photograph attached. And so indeed the genealogy of what we now have of the headshot of the actor's face on one side of on one picture affixed on the back, their resume, that practice of creating a file card for each actor with an image and their resume was in some ways begun with the scientific casting mechanisms that William Hayes introduced in 1926. And so part of what I came to understand was that the headshot became a device to sort of place some material distance between the casting representative and the actor. And indeed, the Office of Central Casting came but 2 years after what is arguably the first time that we really see the casting couch as sort of illicit scenario enter into the popular vernacular. The first documentation that's often pointed to of the first time we hear the real popularization of this idea is as a pornographic film that was introduced in 1924, which takes what becomes the casting couch scenario and narrates it in a particular way that it becomes remarkably consistent in captivating this metonymic notion of the idea that it is on the casting couch that's a man with power finds his exploited, is able to exert his will in the transactional intimacy of an aspiring or striving actress. And so here the scenario is an actress comes to a casting director, she's following the instructions of a book, How to Be a Movie Star, and then by the end she learns the only way to become a star is to get under a good director and work your way up. And in 1924, the casting couch, this is a film that survives. It's one of the it's a stag film that ended up, as many stag films from the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s, entered into the currency of stag culture, as did the very device of the casting couch itself. The casting couch becomes a recurring trope in a variety of segments of American popular culture, but nowhere more prominently than what I'm calling stag culture, the sort of the culture of illicit entertainment oriented toward a presumptively heterosexual and presumptively male audience. And this is a culture that exists in the realm of a peculiar, a sort of a mode of coded jokes or modes of publication that can sort of just elide the obscenity laws and are often circulated in very independent means of distribution, not unlike going to a lithograph dealer and asking for material that is sold under the counter. This stag culture, much like the stag films that Casting Couch was one example of, is in some ways, stag culture really does circulate in this sort of just off the side of legitimate culture. And so, of course, by the 1950s and 1960s, we begin to see what becomes the signal feature of stag culture, which is men's magazines. Here's The Dude, which begins publication just a few years after Playboy. But then also we see documentation of the casting couch in the whole host of genres that are in some ways the signal genres of stag culture. Men's magazines, of course, but then also girly cartoons, which appear in a variety of magazines. Here is a casting couch scenario that comes out of Playboy magazine in 1954. As I move clockwise around the screen, you'll see I've also got the highlight of a casting couch a pulp novel or sleaze novel. Sleaze is the variation of pulp that goes a little bit more explicit. Then as we move down to the bottom, you'll see the record of the LP album, the party albums, which were a blue comedy that was sometimes musical and sometimes just joke tellers, that was often sold in under the counter or through subscription because they did not have traditional commercial distribution. And then in the oldest example on the as we move around, the Tijuana Bibles, which in some ways are a early iteration of explicit pornography that were sold. These are 8-page comic books effectively that are very perishable, not meant to survive. And but in all of them, it's not too hard to scratch the surface and then discover the idea of the casting couch's motif. And so part of what I'm interested in as I'm sort of leaping out of the book project and trying to figure out what are the truths of the casting couch, part of what I'm interested in is in a lot of ways some of the same questions that we heard Tavia raise, which is where do we find evidence of that which does not leave other evidentiary traces? And part of what I'm interested in the circulation of the casting couch scenario is in some ways the casting couch serving as a pop cultural rumor, as a rumor cycle that actually circulates in popular culture products, leaving evidentiary traces of what are otherwise unknowable and unspeakable truths, but are nonetheless naming them in plain sight. Here I'm drawing upon the history and the folklorist scholars like Patricia A. Turner and others who are really looking at the way rumors and urban legends and dark humor and these forms of inappropriate discourse that nonetheless are ways of naming and describing the operation of societal power that is otherwise undocumented in traditional or respectable cultural ways. So part of what I'm very interested in is how are these just off the side, these sideways jokes that appear in a men's magazine, how do they end up narrating and documenting sort of a reality of how power operates even when it does, through all kinds of mechanisms, elude publicity or elude explicit documentation. So part of what I also should note as I come up toward the end of my time is that what I'm interested in, and I focused on stag culture, but we do see the continuation of the trope of the casting couch being invoked. It's really in the period from roughly the 1920s to the 1960s that we hear it mostly in this sort of sideways snicker of the joke or the tragic tale that is sort of in the realm of illicit culture. Beginning in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, we begin to see fewer examples of the casting couch being invoked as a joke, as we begin to see more examples of it being pulled in as cautionary tales, as things not to do, or sort of warning articles about aspiring actors and actresses not to fall prey to the promises of the casting couch. But all of which does go again to this question of my fascination with this sort of proliferation of public art in the era right around Weinstein, this way of sort of using the casting couch to again operate by naming a history and by naming a long tradition with that had been in public view and in public knowledge, but had very rarely been able to sort of be named not only as an individual incident, but as a broader and more substantial cultural phenomenon. And indeed, the Tawdry, Terrifying, Totally True History of the Casting Couch offers one example about how the tools of performance studies might actually help us activate archives that are hidden in plain sight in ways to see how they document stories that have yet to be told. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both Tavia and Brian. And the questions are already coming in. So I'm going to start with one that I suspect is related to some of the people's initial questions, Tavia, about your, the figure of Mary Jones and Peter Sibley. So this is a 7-part question, but I'm going to go ahead and read the whole thing. Thank you. Were there a whole series of lithographs of Mary Jones circa 1830? Who may have purchased them? Were you suggesting that she was safely passing as a trans woman in Lower Manhattan? What was the significance of her sachet and purse? You used the term that included amalgamation. What was that referring to? Was Mary a commodity, a prostitute? And that's a whole really great series of questions. Do you want me to read them again? I went through those pretty quickly.
Wow, I was trying to like go from 1 to 7 on that. There's not a whole series. There are multiple versions of the same lithograph. So they're at least, I saw the one, I mean, they're all over the internet, of course, but the print that's in the New York Historical Society is the one that I looked at. There's one in the National Museum of American History, is also talked about, and there are no doubt others. So the second question was successful passing. Yes, part of I was, compressing my tale into a little bit more than 10 minutes. There's just a lot more there that that in which Mary Jones talks about living as a transgender woman in her community and working as a sex worker. Someone in the contemporary moment talks about her as a kind of foremother of the art of the scam, which I think might give way of answering that third question around money making and practical amalgamation, because the idea of amalgamation, which has kind of come down to us as the word that people used before they had the term miscegenation, meaning the kind of race mixing of the races, actually has a whole lot of other weird meanings prior to the middle of the 19th century, including meanings that are drawn from metallurgy and alchemy, right? So fool's gold, or making gold out of illicit practices, right, is very much in the in the set of connotations around from the time of a term like practical amalgamation. What were the other questions?
What was the significance of the sachet and purse?
The dress de la mode New York, right? À la mode de New York.
I think responding to that in particular, but I think also there's sort of a larger question of how did that figure into her practice?
Well, in my research, I'm like booting up the memory banks. I was very interested, and maybe you, Catherine, would be able to say more, but like I was in a longer version of this presentation, I would sort of contrast like E.W. Clay's highly racist caricatures of Black men and women from like the Life in Philadelphia series from really about the same period, right, to images of women in like Godey's Ladies Book, which actually the Man Monster much more closely approximates, right? So the title is very salacious and sensationalist, but whoever drew that image, it's like it's a la mode de New York, right? And so that's as far as I got into costume history, is that like I went and looked at a bunch of kind of images from that period of Godey's Ladies Book, and what, I roughly had the sense, and I could be completely off, that this is, these are the latest fashions. She's like a fashionable lady. But more important than that is she's the artist is portraying her as pulling those off successfully, right? It's actually one of the most, I want to pull it back up right now so we can look at it, like it's actually one of the least hateful images of a Black person from that period, short of photographs of Frederick Douglass, right? And that's kind of a weird, anyways, I'm kind of going on too long, but what do you think about the sash and in the purse. I mean, you
No,
know, there's
yeah.
also a wallet that she's carrying, right? Which is the wallet from Robert Haslam is the John who she pickpockets, and she's actually arrested and sent to jail for grand larceny, not for prostitution. But in the course of the arrest and trial, her ruse is revealed, as it were.
Well, I guess I have two responses to that. One is I think you're really on about the Godys, and also about the life in Philadelphia. But we do have some really fantastic dress historians in the audience that could probably answer that better than I can. But I think, you know, part of this question is also about, like, what was the nature of her practice? What was she doing? You know, she wasn't convicted for sex work, but for grand larceny. So what was her work?
I don't know that I can do better than what Tourmaline says, you know, making a wayward way out of no way. So, you know, you know, she was turning tricks, and but also competing in or appearing in balls in these frocks in the Black community, and that she testified into court was actually you know, known and accepted not only in New York but also in New Orleans, which is also interesting that a sort of this is still a slave state in that time, right? But somehow that there could be this Eastern Seaboard circulation of Black trans queer culture, right? You know, so there, you know, there was a period in which she served in the military. So, but I don't know. I think part of the reason that the Times never wrote an obituary is they didn't know one person. By the time they came to me, I had kind of moved on from this research. So I wasn't going to start doing it for them, but I'm like, oh yeah, please do, like, fill out all the details, and, you know, if you want. In the absence of that kind of historical reconstruction, I think that's where we get these narratives like Mary of ill fame, which is now in the MoMA. So maybe that's the work, is being a transcestor, right? Being an inspiration.
Yeah, I think there's, you know, a question of who her clientele was, and there's a follow-up question, and then I want to move on to other questions. But you know, how did you find the records of her? You know, who were her patrons?
Well, the clientele are, I mean, the men who are engaged in this sort of entrapment that ends up in the arrest. You know, one of her, you know, I mean, basically the way she is caught in this particular version is that she picks two pockets, and one man recovers the other man's wallet, finds the other, you know, and one of them is brothers with a policeman, you know, and so this is white working class New York, right? And this is also 1836, so it's like 2 years after anti-abolitionist, anti-amalgamationist riots in the streets of Lower Manhattan, you know, have like terrorized the Black community, right? So those are her clientele, in a manner of speaking, right? And like the last question, sorry, was
about the sources.
The sources, yes. So again, like, you know, okay, how did I come to first encounter? Jonathan Ned Katz writes about her in his book Love Stories, and a couple historians of sex work in New York write about, you know, that's where I first encountered the story, and then became interested in the print and then through the print began to like branch out. So I think the arc of my book in Thou Shalt Appear is like sort of the first 3 chapters, the Amalgamation Waltz, were all this sort of archival historical work, and then I got increasingly interested in like artists who were also delving. I actually met artists, that kind of blew my mind. A weird anecdote I just thought of just right now. In the American Antiquarian Society, there was like an artist in residence who was like doing research, but like what she was making was she was making string fiber art, and that's kind of blew my mind. You get funded to go to the American Antiquarian Society and make fiber art. Seems so much more interesting than what I was doing there, but like that kind of planted the seed that that people were using the archive for all kinds of things. And this was at a period, we all know, right, on this panel, right, when archive wasn't just all on the internet. Like you actually had to go and get permission and put on white gloves and all that to sort of see the physical objects, and now there's many more kind of digitized versions of all this that that make it that offer new opportunities for continuing to sort of rethink what these pasts mean in relationship to the present.
Thank you, Tavia. I have a question here for Brian, and then I want to open it up to our panelists. And then beyond that, I have a more general question about sort of the framework of performance studies. But Brian, I want to pose these questions to you first about the casting couch. This is also a multi-part question. So thinking about the casting couch, the examples of the casting couches shown, or mid-century, tend to resemble the Victorian fainting couch or the psychoanalyst couch. Both are similar to daybeds and both have links to women's vulnerability and weaknesses or confession. Had those comparisons entered your research?
I don't know that they've entered my research, except for the fact that they are clearly in the mix. I think what's very clear in the kinds of couches. I mean, one of the things I'm always looking for is not just the invocation of the couch, but actual depictions of the couch, like which are the couches that are depicted. And what I do think is really useful about thinking between the analyst couch, the fainting couch, the daybed, they're often in intermediate spaces of consciousness, intermediate spaces of vulnerability. There are these in-between couches. There are couches that are both, but there's a lot of chaise lounges. There's a lot of these kinds of examples. But I do think we also see pretty quickly in the depiction of it, the thing as I was tracking it in terms of the way that Plastic Jesus and Ginger depict it, they evoke an older style couch, which is not actually that common in the more contemporary evocations of the casting couch. Like the Chris Ware New Yorker depiction was much more of a sort of a mid-century modern daybed. And then also what I will say is that something that didn't make into this is as we enter the 21st century, there began to be a lot more sort of conventionally masculine couches depicted, especially slightly overstuffed leather couches. And indeed, I think you can look at the Victorian style of even the Plastic Jesus couch as being one that was likely leather, or one that would be found in a hotel. So, but there's a clip, for example, of a comedy sketch on the Pornhub website of the guy whose job it is to clean the casting couch, and it's a big overstuffed leather couch. And so what we begin to see is that I think it is that kind of the couch that is not that is designed for serving an intermediate purpose. That seems to be the most consistent thing. Something that can be a bed, but you can call it a couch. Something that is sort of on the in-between. So I do think that conceptually, though, it's really useful to think of the couch as a space of intermediate consciousness, of both somewhat awake or somewhat asleep, a space of deep vulnerability, which I think both the fainting couch and the analyst couch open up, is the anxieties about vulnerability, especially of women in a non-homosocial environment. So I think that there is, clearly they're there and they're related, but they're not the same. And we do see sort of versions of the couch scenario appearing in other professions other than Hollywood. But it is typically almost a riff on the ubiquitous trope of the anxiety of working people of opposite genders and of disparate power and age differentials occupying similarly spaces behind closed doors. And the couch is typically the activator of that vulnerability.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I do want to follow up on the initial question I posed and then open it up, which is, can you tell us something about performance studies and what is that framework? How does that, you're all working in a really intersectional way with other kinds of programs and disciplines. And this may not be an answerable question in 5 minutes or less. But for us here at Bard Graduate Center, we're not so familiar with that framework. So if you could tell us a little bit about at least how you think about it, that would be really helpful.
Well, I mean, I'll start because my thought is I think you can see a lot of how the affinities between Tavia and my presentation tonight, as disparate as the content was, there were certain methodological affinities, which is about not only about simultaneous temporalities of thinking about how that we can draw how contemporary artists are picking up something from the past and making something new with it. And that sort of goes with what Robin Bernstein might call a scriptive thing of how we can see traces of prompts toward past actions in the archive, and I can also use the embodied responses to those in the contemporary as a way back to the archive. So it's not just how an object or a practice or a prompt sort of continues a life, it's how actually its contemporary life can also be the breadcrumbs back to its past life. And so in some ways, it's about reading between the lines of the official documents to see what other actions are hinted or cued by the archive that does survive. Because the one thing that performance studies always works in is an incomplete archive, an archive that is incomplete, imperfect at the back end of any archival box. The stuff that is often considered ephemeral or unimportant are often the most valuable cues to what the questions and answers we seek in performance studies.
Thank you. Tav, do you want to reflect on that?
Oh, it's hard to top that. Studies. Everything Brian just said, and then also maybe the where he kind of left off and thinking about the ephemeral. I think that one of the things that is one of the things that's interesting and troubling, right, and about like the Mary Jones archive is that it's salacious, right? I mean, Tourmaline calls one of her films, Salacia, and the ephemeral as it's theorized by, for instance, Jose Munoz, is actually about that space that is dirty or brown, or blurred or messy. And there's a way in which a response to that is often to want to kind of clean and tidy things up, right? And so this desire to assign, a stable meaning, right? I mean, obviously we conserve, material culture, right? And we reconstruct, lost and obliterated kind of communities like Seneca Village, right? At the same time, like in that kind of reconstruction and conservation and curatorship, right? Can we also account for the ways in which that sort of residue is important, like traces of that residue actually are important, right? And in all their different aesthetics, right? Like, so Leslie Starr has like one kind of, it's assemblage and painting, Arthur Jafa's like photography. I couldn't decide if Vaginal Davis was doing a painting or a drawing or color, and and Tourmaline works in film, right? So they have different aesthetics, but they all allow them to touch different aspects of like the ephemeral, right? And and then there are other artists who um, including actually an earlier version of this. I gave this once at the National Portrait Gallery, and I found in my research that someone had a tattoo of Mary Jones. I don't know how I found this person on Twitter, of course, I think, and so we had a correspondence on DMs, and it's like, I think they may have found me. I think they may have seen that I was giving a talk, and they're like, hey, I have that tattoo. And so we talked about it. Like, what does it mean to put what's more ephemeral, but also more like than, or what's more mortal than a tattoo, right? So I think performance studies is very good for thinking about those kinds of questions.
Absolutely. I think our panelists would like to join us, so please go ahead and turn on your cameras and go ahead and raise your hand for any of you who want to start us off. Okay, I saw Helen.
Hi Tavia, it's so lovely to see you. Welcome.
Yes, great to see you.
My first question is about the circulation of images. I want to know how the artists that you talked about found Mary Jones. Did they find Mary Jones through reading your book? And can you talk a little bit about the role of scholarship in intervening in the circulation of images, of creating these genealogies of artists, and thinking about the way that her image comes out of the archive and becomes part of the repertoire of gestures and visuality?
Yeah, okay, so I think the larger question is the more important one, right? So in my own case, the only the artists, I certainly am not like Mary Jones's like agent, right? So like people find her story from a lot of different places, right? And I don't think it's me per se. I do think that the exhibit at Leslie Lohman did kind of create a bit of an uptick in terms of like there was like a website, and the Jonathan Ned Katz, the lesbian gay historian, very important, from had and also very devoted to kind of putting documents up on the web and making it public available, since he's not an institutional scholar. It's important that I credit kind of community historians before, like myself, for instance, like for doing this kind of preservation and circulation. And then now, of course, there are like trans archives. So if you kind of go look around, there are a lot of different people, Black archives. I think maybe some credit I can make perhaps is I sort of really made this argument that we should think about Mary Jones / Peter Swally in relationship to Black history in 19th century and antebellum Black history. And I think there's been some movement there where this figure who kind of seems sort of, seems more interpretable in terms of, more contemporary notions of who could be included in like a Black story, right? And, but as I said before, Leslie Sarr found the print in this like book of like just oddities, historical oddities, right? And was kind of inspired to draw that. Tourmaline, I think in one interview I read, came up with the idea while tripping in Central Park, which I kind of love because it sort of connects in a way precisely to this idea that you could cite this story of Maryville fame in Seneca Village and not simply Laura Manhattan. I mean, we don't know that she didn't go to Seneca Village, but we don't have any evidence either, right? But except the evidence that that Tourmaline has found in her script. So I think that the role that and I think there's someone on the call is going to say more about the history of Seneca Village, right? But like, you know, historians who find documents, archaeologists who find objects, interpret them, are on one level working quite hand in glove, so to speak, with like artists and also with sort of activists when we think about like trans and queer figures. There's also a bit of a competition insofar as like every artist that I've talked to so far, you know, has been really committed to this idea that history is a fiction, right? And most historians are pretty committed to this idea that like, you know, whatever, you know, and so what do we do with that, right? I mean, they're both narrative, right? Or there's a certain narrative impulse, but you know, it is that space of the unknown, right, that artists want to investigate, and that is somewhat in tension with, you know, at times with kind of like historical method. Hence that need to kind of pin down and ask very kind of like literal questions about, you know, the gender of an historical subject, right? When in fact, you know, I think trans history and trans studies has made us more alert than ever to the kind of violence of needing to make that kind of trans historical, you know, determination, right? But I could go on, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tavia. I see we have questions from Lauren and from Colin. So Lauren, do you want to go ahead? You're muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you, Tavia and Brian, for really insightful presentations in a very short amount of time. That's I imagine how difficult that was to pare it down. One thing that came through in both of your talks that really fascinated me was this idea of criminality, and shifts in criminality. You know, that we know Mary Jones's story, particularly because she's arrested. And I'm wondering, Tavia, if you can speak a bit about how working, I imagine the court was a huge influence in documentation, like one of the rare places where a knowledge about both her as a suspect and someone that's prosecuted, how you can use sort of legal proceedings and arrests as ways to reclaim these transgressive figures, and particularly for people working in the trans community that are looking. I love that term of the transcestor, when you're trying to reclaim histories for people that have been prosecuted and criminalized. Their existence has been criminalized. How that as a source it can be. What are the challenges and kind of opportunities in working in that vein, if you can speak to that? And Brian, in turn, kind of the opposite end of that, you know, a practice that is criminal but not prosecuted, and only kind of comes to public light when Weinstein's finally brought to court, when this is sort of made public. How that process of you know, were you finding instances where there were kind of swells to change practices? You had mentioned Hayes and central casting in the 1920s, but I'm interested in how this practice, the history of it being sort of made unacceptable, or there being legal action taken in changing it, and what makes this moment different or the same as those times. So I know that was a lot, but if Tavia, I guess, could start, I'm interested to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren, and I'll be quick on that to let Brian gather his thoughts. So I'm, you know, I was always been interested in Foucault's approach in The Lives of Infamous Men, right? Where he looks to archives that exist, to people whose lives exist, lives that come down, people whose lives come down to us in the moment of their criminalization by the state, right? And he sort of imagines what would it mean to kind of tell history from that perspective. It's not exactly history from below, but it's a kind of a counter discourse of history, right? Wherein the kind of order of knowledge that is represented in the archive is thrown in its kind of thrown in its face. So in the particular example of Mary Jones, I did go down to the courthouse and pull up her case file and read the case. I wasn't the first to do it, but I wanted to do it myself, just to, I don't know, wanted to be diligent, so working with primary documents, you kind of get the testimony in the court, right? And but it's still the way I interpreted that testimony. I would interpret it differently than I did today, right? I mean, than I did 15 years ago, whenever I read that book. In that I read her testimony. I mean, maybe not. Well, at one level, I read it as first person evidence of, and knowing but not knowing that, of course, this is a coerced, so she's asked, who are you, where, what's your name, where were you born? And she gives her name is Peter Swally. She gives her birth date. She actually says, I am a man, so at the time I thought, well, that's enough. I'll assign gender somehow as an historian, right? But I'm like, well, what else could she have said to that court at that time, right? So this is where I think the historical imagination comes into play, right? And you think about the micro dynamics of power, and in a way, although presentism is always seen as an ugly word, or it used to be, maybe it no longer is. Maybe we left presentism as a slur back in the 20th century, which I would love to hear, right? But I was worried of being presentist, right? By bringing present, when in fact, actually our present understanding of how people should say dissemble, a cultural dissemblance in the face of power. So I think that's an important proviso for sort of using, court records. But they are, there's wonderful, Sarah Haley has a great book, No Mercy Here, where she studies women convicts, and does a much deeper and broader version of what I just described, right? Is like sort of reading court testimony and social work, various investigators' testimony into people's lives, while understanding that the person who's kind of giving account of themselves and their history and their crimes and their perception of their gender, they're always situated, that information is situated, that's a power dynamic, right? In what is being recorded by the courts, yeah. And in some ways, this sort of the more literally free version of and more intuitive response to the past, and some of the visual culture can kind of cue us into precisely those limits in the record when we're dealing with the 19th century, at least, so much of which is and 19th century before, so much of which comes down to us as the print, although I'm interested in this, as a main bridge to Brian, is I think Brian's idea is exactly right, is that H.R. Robinson is the dude purveyor of his day, right? This is definitely stag culture, right? Circa 1830s, so it is definitely visual culture of a salacious kind.
yeah, and I guess that the thread in terms of thinking between, the historical arc of between is, I think what I find sort of fascinating is that to my knowledge, there's only 2 times when the conversations about circulating around the casting couch and really the sort of the exploitative intimacies of the transactional collaborations of the entertainment industry, the only times that they become seemingly spectacular are the early 1920s and the later 20 teens. And that's 10 decades separate. Those are 10 decades separation, right? And so what do we have is there's these moments of spectacular period, like there's almost a spectacular century periodization where this scandal that absorbed federal and state governances, sort of involved trade industries, all these things that led to actual change that didn't actually make the phenomenon go away. It just moved from the spectacular to the spectral. And so the spectacle of the casting couch, which was very absorbing in early 1920s, then becomes the specter of the casting couch, which sort of haunts and edges on the side over the intervening decades. And it's really like Harvey Weinstein got in trouble, but it's not like he was the only one with the practice of the casting couch. And so in some ways, I think that part of what is how do we document, like, because it's in some way, that's why I like the Chris Ware New Yorker cover, is that both are faceless. And so that there is this kind of sense where it's not like the casting couch with Plastic Jesus and Ginger, where it was very much Harvey Weinstein. There's this idea where the empty daybed that then becomes a scandalous object nearly 20 years after its installation, the faceless figures on the Ware cover, those two open up the sense of the spectacle as being societal, not individual. And I think that is the question, is we tend to want to focus on the remarkable individual, and that's an easier story to tell. But how do you deal with structural violence? How do you deal with the sort of structures that create the apparatus that endorses and encourages transactional intimacies, which are really vulnerable to this kind of sexual exploitation and other kinds of exploitation? So part of what I'm interested in is like, how is it seeable the whole time, even when it's not a spectacle? And what are the sources that might be illicit or unofficial sources that actually make the breadcrumbs of saying, this is constant, this is ongoing, and it's being discussed. It's just not always being taken seriously because it's in the form of a girly joke, of a girly comic in a men's magazine. So there is a kind of way of how do we thread that history, even when it's spectral as opposed to spectacular.
Thank you so much. I see we have a question from Colin, and I think we have from Meredith. So we'll go ahead with Colin.
Thank you. And I've just been informed by Zoom that my internet connection is unstable, so if I drop out, apologies. But Brian, I was really struck by the way in which you were describing stag culture as sort of just off to the side of legitimate discourse, or a way that this kind of shadowy culture names or documents, realities of power structures. It sort of occurred to me that structurally, that's not dissimilar to the way a lot of queer history and queer, culture and community has been talked about. And I just found that so interesting, that there's this kind of alterity in one sense can be used to exploit and degrade, or it can be used to sort of liberate or build community or empower. So I guess, I don't know if there's really even a question here, but just, is there any value to thinking through those things in kind of the same frame? Are they the same sides of two, or the opposite sides of the same coin, or do you not see them really as interrelated at all?
I do see them interrelated, and I do so. And one of the things I'm really interested by is the way that the rhetoric shifts in the, and it has a lot to do with obscenity laws. It has a lot to do, and so for both queer culture and also stag culture, it has to do with the shifting obscenity laws, and especially the way that obscenity laws shifted in the later 1950s and then again in the early 1970s. And so when it's not kind of a sort of a subcultural thread, like this idea of you have to find the person who knows the person, or sort of have your own secret stash. Because my work as a historian of popular performance, I very rarely can rely upon conventional archives. The archives I am most reliant upon are often what we might generously call collectors, but often which ops in the mode of hoarders of beloved objects, that then when they die, their relatives sell the stuff on eBay so I can get my hands on it. And so a lot of this stuff is in this space of a cultural space that doesn't necessarily attach to community. And one of the things that we really see very quickly happen in the early 1970s, once sexuality becomes less illicit and less illegal and more in the space of expression and liberation, especially for straight men, we see the rhetoric of the casting couch move into like there's no more pulp novels. They're more like narratives of a liberated woman, still telling the same story, but it's from the perspective of someone who's not a vulnerable sort of naif or wanderer, but somebody who's empowered doing it. Or it moves much more into the admonition addressing women in women's magazines and those kind of things that are really talking about being a young actress. And then even when it starts edging out in the 80s and 90s, it just becomes an old joke as opposed to a descriptive of something current. You know, my favorite example is this party game, one of those sort of murder dinner party games, which uses the casting couch as a scenario. And this is from 1988. So it's not so much that it shifts in where it is, it shifts in terms of who's excited by the idea and what is that excitement? Is that a salacious excitement and titillating excitement? Or is that a different kind of lurid excitement? Or is it in some ways a throwback? And that's, I think, why I'm fascinated by the story of Road to Hollywood, where this giant daybed is the end of the road to Hollywood, and it's sort of like, that's a casting couch. It's not, and when it's sort of announced and scandalous, it sort of is removed. And even then the art critic is saying, that's a misreading of the exhibit. It's not a casting couch, it's just a daybed. You know, it's like this kind of way of what are we seeing and what are we choosing not to see, which for me is a metaphor of sexual harassment. What is happening that is not being recognized as what it is. And that's, I think, in some ways, why the sort of sideways history of the casting couch actually tells us a lot about the normalization of sexual violence in 20th century culture.
Thank you, Brian. Meredith, did you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Oh, sure. Thanks, Catherine. And thanks, Brian and Tav. This has been really stimulating. And I'm interested in something that you've both talked about, the way in which artists and art can open up different interpretations of history and of the archive, particularly for people and events that there aren't, the normal volume of records for. And as someone who's worked on the Seneca Village project for quite a long time now, piecing together artifacts and bits from the archive to create stories, narratives that are partially fictional, partially part of my imagination and the imagination of many other people who are involved in doing this research. In the field, one of the things we do is sort of spin stories together, really. Like, what do you think they use this for? What do you think? What do you think it was like to live here? That sort of thing is something we play with in the field, but also like we're as archaeologists, historical archaeologists, we are very attentive to the evidence, something that Tavia brought up, and how far are we allowed, or should we ethically stray from that evidence? And so my question is around that, and particularly when we're studying named individuals. So not a hypothetical actress, right, who might be sitting on the casting couch, who's depicted in a work of art, but a named individual, a person who exists in history. Is that more complicated on both sides of these equations? The creation of the historical narrative with the archival and material evidence, and also the artistic creation of the way that individual's life is interpreted. Is it more complex if you're working with a named person?
What I'm going to tag in just very quickly, because I've thought of Marnie Sandweiss a couple times in this conversation, because Marnie Sandweiss is my colleague here at Princeton, and she led the Princeton and Slavery Project. And when she launched that archival project, which was really driven by evincing the archival documentation of Princeton's relationship to the broad phenomenon and practices of chattel slavery. One of the things that she was very clear about was when the website launched, she wanted to make sure there were art installations in tandem, both visual art and performing art. So she commissioned playwrights. She had me teach a class with students telling stories about their encounter with the archive. You know, she said, and one of the things she kept saying is she says, I know as a historian that there are things that the evidence obliges us to tell, but there are certain things that as a historian, the historical method doesn't let me tell, stories it won't let me tell, that the evidence actually prompts me to think about. And so she said that the arts for an archival, opening up an archive and learning how to figure out what this archive actually holds. She was very firm that we had to have rigorous historical method and we had to have creative investigation operating in tandem, because doing one or the other means that neither will be able to bloom. And so I really have taken a strong lesson from her ethos around that in terms of understanding the reciprocal relationship between creative investigation and evidentiary and being responsible to the evidence.
I agree. Couldn't have put it better.
I was just going to say, I see our time is limited and we have a few more people in the queue. So, so Emily, Ivan, and Helen, do you want to ask your questions in a row, and then we'll see if we can ask our panelists to respond to them as a group? I've put you guys in a tough spot, but.
Sure, I'll go first. First, just a comment, Brian, when you were talking about the casting couch, I was thinking a lot about the Whisper Network as well as like a invisible circulatory process that exists around that. But that's not my question. My question is I'm sort of stuck on this, like, artists interested in history as fiction, and the historian. And I guess I want to ask a question about witnessing. In my experience, like really beautiful experiences of performance turn me from a spectator into a witness in some way, shape, or form. And I guess I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the experience of witnessing in your work as historians, and if there's something there that's a kind of juicy point of connection between the artist's project and the historian's project.
And we're taking the 3 questions in quick succession, is that right? Yeah.
Okay, so am I next? Thanks. I want to ask a question about truth. Somewhat unfashionable in some areas of study, but I'm going to just read 2 quotations by the same author. The first is, do we truly need a true sex? And the second, among its many emblems, our society wears that of the talking sex, the sex which one catches unawares and questions, and which, restrained and loquacious at the same time, endlessly replies. One day, a certain mechanism, which was so elfin-like that it could make itself invisible, captured this sex, and in a game that combined pleasure with compulsion and consent with inquisition, made it tell the truth about itself and others as well. Both those quotations are by Michel Foucault. The second is from volume 1 of the History of Sexuality. And the first, do we truly need a true sex, are the first words of his introduction to the Herculine Barbin, being the recently discovered memoirs of a 19th century French hermaphrodite. So I'm not a Foucauldian, but Foucault philosophically often has some interesting things to say. And I wonder if you have interesting things to say in response to Foucault's questions about truth in relation to sex.
My question is much less philosophical. Brian, I'm really interested in the way that the language and the images you showed displace the culpability of the perpetrator and put it on the couch. They make the couch the active agent of the crime. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that.
I'll see if I can thread those very quickly. Whisper Network, artist affects the artists and of like the question of witness, and then the notion of truth, and then the couch. I do think that in some ways the couch is the key to this. The reason why the casting couch, the way it operates and the way it displaces culpability, is it actually is a way of naming the structural conditions that encourage the violence. That by sort of displacing it from either the perpetrator or the victim, it names the truth of the situation, which is this is a system that is built upon the conditions of this violation. And it's you can blame it on one person, but it's really the couch is going to be there when that person gets hauled off. So the couch is in some ways names the structural violence, and in some ways the couch, I think that's why I found Eric, I'm blanking on her name, but the artist behind Road to Hollywood, the blank couch, the empty couch, is in some ways always a very provocative reminder of that we are understanding the way the structure works because we can see the scene even when there's no enactors of the scene. So by seeing the couch, we witness the violence. It is separate from the human violation. So in some ways, for me, it goes back to the ways in which this oscillating notion of, do we need bodies to have sex, or is sex actually operating societally and structurally? Sort of some of the core Foucauldian challenges that asks us of what is the source of our understanding of some of these oscillations. And for me, that is the essence in some ways of challenging us, whether we're looking at evidence or whether we're looking at art or whether we're looking at phenomenons like the Whisper Network or the casting couch, which are naming things that are otherwise unseeable, but we just sort of dismiss them as being sideways whispers or random sideways jokes, but they're actually naming structural realities, but they're not rhetorically valued as truth. And so this is part of what I think I'm trying to sort of work in between of what is being documented in these sideways ways.
Great.
Okay, you have the last word.
Oh, no. No pressure. This has been such a rich conversation. Well, I'm gonna have to think further about Emily's question about spectatorship versus witnessing. I'll just have to think about that. Maybe an answer will come to me as I try to answer Ivan's question about truth, which is not an unfashionable word in my lexicon. I'm actually obsessed with truth, as any good Foucauldian will be, right? And I'm obsessed with the will to truth specifically, right? What he called the will to truth, which is what I now think about when I think about both the police power that produced Mary Jones as an historical subject that's available for us, like a named subject, you know, that I can go into the courthouse and research, and we can look at an image or images, versions of an image online. You know, this is the police power of the state, right? Which is something, you know, that Foucault is quite interested in, right? And then he's also interested in the quotes that you mentioned, right? In the discovery or the deployment of sexuality, right, as a truth of the self, that you know, that he is suspicious of, and he wants to, you know, he wants to ask whether in fact there is a virtue in dissembling that truth, or at least being playful or parodic of the seriousness with which, you know, we think that by getting to the truth of our sex, we get to the truth of ourselves or something, right? I think that subversiveness is at play in what so many of the artists who respond to, like, Mary Jones are responding to, that there's, you know, and that it is, I don't know that I can say more than that, right? Is that what we are if we relink, artists are far issue, huge, massive generalization, right? They're not, I think they're much more willing to enter into the unknown and the speculative, right? Than at least some historians, right? Or some people who feel that the evidence is, and in fact, Foucault is often seen as an untrustworthy historian precisely because he's such a speculative philosopher on top of being someone who's interested in archives. The capacity, the interest in the will to truth for me is also an interest in the powers of the false, which is another way of thinking about fabulation. But the powers of the false are not the powers of falsification, right? Or mendacity, right? I think this is important, and especially in the era of 45, right? That critical fabulation is not like malicious lying attached to making power plays, right, in a society, right? We don't have time to talk about Hamilton, but like here's like a massive problem with like evasions of history in Hamilton. I do think that that artists can and should be held accountable to the past, right? But when the powers of the false are evoked, I think in the most interesting way, it's when they are deflating the truth claims of power, right? That is, I think, the spirit of what Foucault means in the history of sexuality, right? Not that we don't need, or that sexuality is not something to value. Sexual minorities, gender dissidents aren't, these are his community, these are his people, right? He's not saying that this is meaningless, but that being too tethered to a notion of the truth rather than the process of becoming, right, is lays a trap, right, for those historical subjects, right? Someone mentioned, I forget now who, like, what is our, maybe it was Emily, right? The idea of like named subjects. Would you mention named subjects on the past? No, that was sorry, it was Meredith. Which name, like, especially when we're talking about Black subjects in the 19th century, right? But or maybe even today, right? Like the name is also imposed, right, upon the patronymic, the slave master's name, right? Like there's an historical, there's a history that we need to witness, right? That we actually do need to think past the the power, the assumption that names give us a kind of bedrock, that names are bedrock somehow, right? Names are also fictions.
I want to thank you both, Brian and Tavia, for these really wonderful talks and this really wonderful discussion. And thank you all, everyone who's attended and our panelists. It's been such a pleasure. Again, we're gonna tail off. The video will be on our website probably in a few weeks. And if you have additional questions, please get in touch with me, and I'll pass them on if Tavia and Brian are willing to continue to answer them. So again, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.